aperture is really easy to understand if you associate it with your eyes. And that's because lenses were made to resemble how our eyes work. There's that front element that receives the light, just like your cornea. Then your cornea bends the light and passes it to the iris. Now the iris, depending on how much light there is available, it will either shrink or expand your pupil. And the size of the pupil is what controls the amount of light that goes into your eye. So think of aperture the same way. Its purpose is to do the same thing, is to control the amount of light that enters your camera. Aperture can be big or small depending on what you set it to. If you set it to the largest size that the lens will allow, we call that wide open or maximum aperture. If you set it to the smallest size, we call that minimum aperture. So let's go back to that eye example. What happens when you're sitting in a really dim environment? Well, because there's not enough light, your eyes start to expand the iris, which then obviously expands the pupil. So more light comes in. Now, when you're outside and it's really, really bright, you'll find that your pupil is now going to be much smaller because it doesn't need all that light to go through. Now that you know what aperture is, let me show you how it actually looks like. So right here, I have a Zeiss 50mm f2 manual focus lens. And the reason why I'm using a manual focus lens is because it's much easier to demonstrate. This is a 50mm f2 lens. Now that f2 means its maximum aperture can be set to f2. So if you look in front of this lens, you can see that right now it's wide open. Wide open meaning the most amount of light is passing through the lens at that f2 setting. Now watch what happens as I start turning that ring. You can see that it's getting much smaller. And right here at its smallest hole, smallest opening, is I'm set to f22. And that f22 is the minimum aperture setting that this lens allows. So with this small of an aperture, if I wanted to get more light into my camera through my lens, I would simply have to open it up. Now, let's talk about f-stops or f-numbers. Now on that lens that I showed you, I talked about numbers like f2 and f22. And if you remember at f2, the lens was wide open, was letting a lot of light through. And when I made that aperture really, really small, I said that's f22, referring to the minimum aperture. Now, it's strange that it sounds that f2 is actually a smaller number than f22, and yet f2 referred to the maximum opening versus smaller opening. Why is that? Now there's something called an f-stop or an f-number, and that number refers to the size of the aperture. Now it's not the physical size of the aperture, it simply refers to how big it is relative to how much light passes through the lens into the camera. Now take a look at this chart, and hopefully it will make it easier for you to understand the size of aperture relative to the f number. You can see that we have it illustrated from f1.4 all the way to f8. Now at f1.4, that's the smallest number, but see how big that aperture looks? And now take a look at f8. That's really, really small. So that's something for you to keep in mind. Always, when you think about the f number, the larger the number, the smaller the aperture. The smaller the number, the larger the aperture. Now you can see in this chart we go from f1.4 to f2, 2.8, f4, 5.6, and f8. Now that change in numbers going from say f1.4 to 2 or from 2.8 to 4 is one stop. The most important thing you need to understand now is that when you switch from say f1.4 to f2, or we just say when you stop down from f1.4 to f2, what you're doing is you're halving the amount of light that is getting through the lens into your camera. Now if you go from f2 back to f1.4, it's going to reverse the effect, and now you're going to basically double the amount of light that's passing through the lens into your camera. But there's something else that you need to keep in mind. Aperture doesn't just control how much light enters into your camera. It also affects the overall look of your image, the aesthetics. There are things like bokeh and depth of field that are also affected by the aperture, but we're going to talk about those later on in the video. So to wrap up, aperture is simply the opening of your lens that controls how much light passes through it into your camera. When it comes to aperture and depth of field, I find that a lot of people struggle with these two concepts, specifically on what depth of field is and how aperture affects it. And a lot of people wonder, well, how do I properly take pictures with my camera so that things are in focus? Well, there's a very easy way to explain this. Now, every digital camera made today has a flat sensor. And if you look at the back of the camera, you have this flat LCD. Well, the sensor inside the camera is sitting parallel to that LCD. And the light that's coming through the lens in front of it is also ending flat right on that sensor. What does that mean? Well, for you to really easily understand depth of field so that it makes total sense is to think of it as a wall. And that wall can be thin, it can be medium size, or it could be thick. And it's always going to be parallel to your sensor. Now, your depth of field, or this imaginary wall, is what's in focus. We call that focus plane. And everything from the front of the wall to the back of it is what's in focus. And if I apply it to the camera, that imaginary wall of depth of field is always going to move with the camera. So this is really cool. Think of it this way. If I'm photographing here, well, my wall is right in front of me, right parallel to that sensor. And if I move this way, now the wall has moved this way, now right in front of me. This is super easy for you to understand, especially in situations where you need to put maybe one person in focus who's completely out of focus just because of the way they're standing. I have a lot of questions from people that ask, well, I have this group in front of me and they're all in a circle. How do I capture so that everybody's in focus? Well, typical answer would be increase your depth of field by changing your aperture. So you could go from, say, f2.8 to like 5.6 or maybe 8. But by doing that, you're changing the aesthetic of the image. Now everything behind your subjects is going to be probably in focus, and you might not want that. Well, if you think of this as the wall, and this is a really easy way for you to understand this, all you have to do is break that circle, put everyone within that wall. So from the beginning of the wall to the end of the wall, since you know that area is in focus, all you have to do is reshuffle people so that they're standing parallel to your sensor. And that's all there is to it. Now we're going to take this concept further, and I will demonstrate exactly what I mean so that you understand it easier. Now for this video, we're shooting with an 85mm portrait lens, and we set the aperture to be really wide so that I can stay isolated from the background. Now that also means that there's very shallow depth of field. At 85mm and this distance, the depth of field is tiny. You can see it. The camera right now is focused on my face. If I move slightly forward or slightly backward, I'm going to be out of focus. Now the reason why I'm holding these two pine cones in my hand is because what I want to do is I want to demonstrate that plane of focus so that it's easy for you to understand. Now I'm holding this pine cone in front of me, and as you can see, it's in focus, but I'm not. And the reason why is because we actually change focus to be right in front of that pine cone. So if you go back to that concept of imaginary wall, that wall is now starting to run from the beginning, the front of this pine cone, and maybe it's ending right here. Well, because I'm not inside that imaginary wall, I'm not in focus. So if you're photographing a group, and maybe that's the first person in the group, I'm the second person in the group, and maybe you have someone standing right here, well, guess what? At this aperture, at this distance, there's no way that you can put all of us in focus. So the solution? Easy. Go back to that wall and just put them in the same plane. Now look at that. Both of them are in perfect focus. So next time you're out shooting, if you have someone who asks you, take my portrait please with these people, all you have to do is make sure that they're standing all parallel in one plane right across your camera. That's all you have to do. Now this concept of depth of field and this imaginary wall where you're putting things in the same focus plane is not something that's limited to just pine cones and people. You can apply it to any type of photography. So if you're shooting out there, just remember, all you have to do is imagine that wall in front of you, put it in parallel to your camera, and everything within that wall will always be in focus. Now there's one caveat to this imaginary wall. I said that it's always going to be parallel to your sensor. Well, that's true if you're using a standard lens. But if you're using a tilt shift lens, or maybe you're using a macro setup with bellows, you can actually bend the setup so that your focus plane is not going to be exactly parallel to the sensor. So just keep that in mind. Right here we have a setup for you to demonstrate how changing aperture impacts depth of field. Now I have an 85mm f1.4 lens, and that's its maximum aperture. I went ahead and set the aperture to that f1.4, and I set the lens so that it's at its minimum focus distance. Now at this distance, I cannot move any closer. If I do that, then things are going to go out of focus. So I went ahead and focused on that Luxia 250 right in front of you, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and change my aperture from f1.4 to 2, 4, 5, 6, 8, 11, and 16. Now f16 is the smallest aperture on this lens, so I cannot go any further, but you'll be able to see what effect it has on the overall image. Now you can see right here where I have the focus plane right on that Luxia 250. To the left of it, I have the Bs, the two Bs. The one on the left, you can see it's slightly sharp, but the rear of the B is not, whereas the other B is completely out of focus. And the same thing is happening to the right side. You can identify some words and letters, but you cannot see everything because that's my focus plane. Now, there is a wine bottle behind this, and it's literally sitting about maybe half a foot behind the front line here, and you cannot see that it's a wine bottle. You cannot read anything from it. Now watch what happens when I start changing it. So from here we go from f1.4, that's f2, that's f2.8. Now as you can see at 2.8 even, I'm now seeing a lot more things sharper to the left and to the right. f4, 5.6, f8, and now the bottle on the back, you can start seeing that it's an actual bottle. f11, and that's at f16. So at f16, you can now see that a lot of things are sharp, which means that all of that area in the front line, starting from the B on the left side to the lens to the blue box to the right, is within that depth of field. So everything is appearing sharp. You can read the letters, you can see everything. But the bottle on the back where it says fade away is still not sharp. It's still a little bit blurry. What does that mean? It simply means that my depth of field pretty much ends there, and now it's getting into the blurry zone. And although that bottle is about half a foot away, the depth of field that I have at f16, which is the minimum aperture, is simply not enough to be able to cover this entire area. So how do I resolve this dilemma? How do I get everything in perfect focus and perfect sharpness? Let's talk about that. In order for me to get that bottle to look really sharp so that it falls within the depth of field, there are a couple of things that I can do without changing my focal length or without changing my lens. So first, I can physically move the bottle, and as you can see, right there, looks pretty sharp. And that means that it's now within the depth of field. And the second thing I can do is I can actually move my camera back a little bit, keep that bottle back to where it was, and then I'm simply going to change my camera to subject distance. Alright, so compared to what I had before, all I did here was move my setup back, so by moving the camera away from that front line and therefore increasing my camera to subject distance, now my depth of field is actually wider. You can see that the bottle in the back, the wine bottle in the back, is now looking much sharper, and everything in the front is still really sharp. So that's something for you to keep in mind. If you're already pushing your lens to the limit and you're still getting things that are not looking sharp, then all you have to do is increase your camera to subject distance, and just doing that will increase your depth of field. If you're shooting a distant landscape, you could still be at f1.4, and because you're set at infinity, everything might appear sharp still, and that's because all of that landscape in the distance is within your depth of field. So don't think that f1.4 or any wide aperture necessarily translates to shallow depth of field. That's not really the case.
We're in downtown Denver today demonstrating Aperture and how it affects the way a photo looks. Now we've set up here, I'm working with the model Melissa, and there's a bunch of columns behind her. And what we're going to do is we're going to change the aperture on the camera, on the lens. We're not going to change the lenses, we're only going to change the aperture. So we're going to go from f1.4 all the way up to f16. That's going to go from biggest aperture down to the smallest aperture this lens can make. And you will be amazed at how different the background looks between f1.4 and f16.
So as you can see, we start with an aperture of f1.4, and that has a very shallow depth of field, and it makes a very blurry background. As we change the aperture to f16, depth of field increases and you can see a lot more detail in the background.
Right now, we have an 85mm lens on this camera doing video, and it's set to f1.4. You can see all these lights behind us are nice and soft and blurry, and there's also really big highlights. That's what's called bokeh. Now watch what happens when we stop down the lens to f11. Now we're set to f11, and you can see the background looks a lot different. All those little lights that were big and blurry before are little points of light. So remember, if you want to get a beautiful background like this and beautiful bokeh, make sure and use your lens as wide open as possible, preferably f1.4, f2, or f2.8.